aren't, stopping, or, well, I guess in China's case, stopping its aid of the Burma's government is because these large, like, capitalistic nations, China and India, more and more increasingly, they're becoming centered around this ideal of capitalism. They're worried about economic issues in their countries. They want to, make sure that if they're going to get involved for a human rights purpose, it's not going to. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that their main interest is going to be the national interest, not necessarily human rights.
So you think that choosing between human rights and choosing for the more money, that they'll choose more money?
In a nutshell, yeah.
And it may not be purely a profit motive. At the same time, China has, you've got 1.3 billion people in China, more and more of whom are driving every year. So there's a massively increasing demand for oil in China. So for them to cut off a huge oil supplier of theirs, it's more than just profit. It's almost, it's a lifeline for them that is necessary to fuel their economic expansion.
So can this conflict even be resolved, towards for the people? Because China and India are both on the sides of the Burmese government, it appears. So, I mean, is there a happy ending to this?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, tragically, it seems like the ending has already, in a sense, come. I mean, the movement has been basically crushed. Thousands of people have been killed or are believed to have been killed. And it was basically because China really blocked any concerted UN action to do something differently.
Well,
Russia
and plus, what can the people do, against, and I don't want to say an all-powerful government, but, with a government that's as powerful as the one in Burma, and then, I mean, obviously a government that's as powerful as the one in China, if those governments are kind of pitted against them, I mean, what are they going to do?
And there's another, I think, aspect to China's involvement, too. It's not just like its own economic interests in the present. I mean, you think back to the Tiananmen Square massacres. Basically, China did something very similar. They basically killed very many people in order, I say China, people in power in China killed many of their own people in order to stay in power. And so it must be very uncomfortable for them to see a similar thing happening right next door to them and have the whole world, paying attention to that when they have the Olympics coming up, like Jonathan was saying. It puts them in a very tough spot.
Well, speaking of paying attention, thanks for paying attention to us. And if you would like to contact us or to be on our show, if you have any questions or comments, give us a call at 213-743-2722 or email us at platforum@trojanvision.com. You can also check us out on the web at www.trojanvision.com. Coming up next, we're going to take a quick break, but then we're discussing more on Myanmar and different conflicts around the world.
Burma.
Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Thank you.
Sorry about that.
Great job, guys. Welcome back to PlatForum. We've been talking a lot about what's been going on recently in Burma with the civilians and monks and their pro-democracy protests. And we've been discussing a lot about India and China's reaction to the conflicts. And now I would like to know, what do you think the rest of the world should do?
Well, they shouldn't sit around doing nothing. I mean, but then again, at the same time, what can be done? I mean, short of a full-scale invasion and an overthrow, kind of like we did in Iraq, I mean, there's not much that, I mean, the UN can put pressure on them and they can, say, they can kind of wag their finger and say you're doing something bad. But, until they get all of the the UN subsidiaries in agreement, and everyone is putting pressure on these, places that are, conducting these, I guess, massacres, for lack of a better word. I mean, it's a really, really tight situation to be in for any leader.
And it seems like right now, Burma is very unpopular with the U.S. government. So the U.S. government is doing quite a bit in the way of like imposing sanctions on the country and things like that. But a military kind of intervention, some people might think this is a great example of where that would be the right thing to do. Aung San Suu Kyi, the woman who is the leader of the democracy movement in Burma, won the Nobel Peace Prize. She is very much opposed to that. She says change needs to happen from within. The Burmese people this needs to be a revolution of the Burmese people. And the most we can do is basically stand in solidarity with them.
But with the majority of them being of the mindset of, peaceful non-compliance, I mean, how is that change going to happen? I mean, it may change within them, but that's not going to change anything around them.
And I think the fundamental problem with the peaceful non-compliance, the reason it worked for Gandhi was because with all the world's eyes on him, the British government had people that it was accountable to. It had people that elected the officials, put them in power, which that's not the case in Burma. So there's not a reason for the Burmese government to respond to that sort of international pressure and pressure from their own people. So that definitely creates a dilemma in terms of how effective is that peaceful non-compliance going to be in this situation. You also mentioned something about sanctions. Economic sanctions, especially in Burma, there's actually a lot of debate right now going on how good of an idea that really is. Are sanctions going to help? Typically, economic sanctions, this really happened in Iraq in the late 90s. Typically, economic sanctions end up hurting the people more than the government. They end up lowering the quality they hurt the entire economy. They end up lowering the quality of living for the people, which then gives the military dictatorship even more control. Now, the U.S. has said, well, we're going to take, instead of imposing sanctions against the entire Burmese economy, we're going to freeze the assets and funds of Burmese rulers in banks that we have control over. So, but the problem with that is, in a military dictatorship, if military funds are frozen, they can just go to the people and take them out of other sectors of the economy and basically refill their bank accounts and pocketbooks. So in the end, it's oversimplified, but in the end, it's the people who are going to be hurting from those sanctions.
And you've talked about the people. What is life like for the people in Burma?
Ron would probably have a better perspective on that than I would.
Well, it's incredibly tough, and I saw a little bit of that along the Thai-Burmese border. We talked about this peaceful movement, but in reality, there's been a lot of fighting actually in Burma over the last 3 or 4 decades, including among the Karen, which are an ethnic group that live in sort of the mountainous region along Thailand and Burma. They waged a fierce war against the Burma army for a long time and held huge areas of territory, but were pushed out in the late 90s. Now, many thousands of those people are living in these refugee camps on the Thai side of the border. I visited them and saw them, and life is very grim for these people. Very little material well-being, and living in basically bamboo huts, that they've constructed.
So what's like a day in the life? I mean, what do they do? I mean, are they in these refugee camps? Do they just kind of sit around and do nothing? I mean, what are they doing?
Well, that is probably about it. I mean, they don't have access to employment. Some of these people try to make it into Thailand, and I was on a bus, for example, with some of these people coming from Burma trying to get into Bangkok where they could find work. And police came onto the bus, hauled them off the bus because they didn't have papers, They're exploited by the Thai police on the one side. If they go back into Burma, they will be abused and suffer all kinds of violence from the Burma army. So it's just a tough situation. That's, of course, on the border, in the border region. It's maybe somewhat different for people living in Rangoon, but all around, people are living in just extreme poverty, extremely difficult circumstances.
And
sorry, go on.
I was saying, in the capital and in Rangoon, where there is a lot more employment, the oil prices recently have made things even worse for those people. There was an article that was published recently where someone interviewed some Burmese workers who it was costing them more to ride the bus to work now with the oil prices raised than they would make in a day worth of work, so they couldn't go to work. Or some of them